I'd like to thank the International Organisation for Migration Data Analysis Centre in Berlin for the use and sharing of a lot of information that we've worked on together. And some of the slides that I'll be showing now have already been prepared for a variety of presentations. And this represents a combination of work and presentations delivered to many international organisations and in international fora. My focus will be coming from a critical perspective as an academic who works in a centre for the study of poverty and social justice. And so I hope that I'll be able to balance the discussion around official sources, data problems, and some of the challenges for looking at policies to address inequalities around migration in the global policy arena as well as at national level. So what I want to cover is the global, regional and national context, the issues around policy and data, and then what the the United Nations have done in response to the data challenges. So at a global level, the UN Statistical Division, UN Population Division and the International Organisation for Migration, which is now the UN's Migration Agency. So it's the lead agency on migration for the United Nations. So in particular, the work of the IOM Centre in Berlin, IOM GIMDAC, as the acronym is, and the capacity building work that I've done there will be part of this presentation. And one of my colleagues from the former colleagues is Dennis Kierans, if you could raise your hand there. So Dennis also worked on some of this, and again, I hope that we can share some experiences if anyone's interested in that work that we did there. Then I'd like to address what I think towards the end, what the critical gap in policy and research is, and the kind of questions that I think scholars and policymakers need to be asking about what is known and what isn't known about migration, and the way in which migration data are used in policy development, and what is missing, where the gaps are. So I hope to conclude with some ideas about how we might all work together more constructively in the future. So what we have today, it's the United Nations Day. Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, has been widely reported around on YouTube and on the internet, highlighting the widening inequalities that we see at global level, the challenge for the UN in general about, although we've seen reduction in some areas in poverty, overall poverty, but there are widening inequalities at global level. So the discussions around migration data and inequality need to be put in that global context. And we're talking in the global context about also the United Nations 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, especially in relation to migration, Target 10.7, which is about safe and orderly migration. So I'll talk a bit more about that. We also have a global compact on migration. There is a global compact on refugees. No doubt you've heard that the United States has decided to pull out from the discussions around the global compact on migration. Nevertheless, there will be a meeting in December in Marrakesh in Morocco, where it is intended to adopt a general statement and work programme for the international policy fora to work towards global better practice around migration. So that's part of this discussion. Now, the challenges in all of these policy initiatives are technical. They are data challenges, but they're technical as well, also to do with resources. They're also methodologically challenging. We have economic, social, and importantly, ethical challenges about how to manage data, collect data, and the kind of questions that should be asked by policymakers, especially in the current rush to see big data in short term as the kind of the holy grail to answer all the questions around tracking mobility and migration, all of those ethical questions around what that means for surveillance of populations, for data privacy, for human rights. These are big issues that need to be tackled by the whole of the data fraternity or data community, as well as the policy community. So we're working now towards a global compact, if all the positive ideas work out okay for safe, orderly and regular migration. And this is seen to be really a new era for policy on migration. Migration is at the top of the global policy agenda. Those who've been in the business of migration data would all confirm these developments would be unthinkable a few years ago. And the heads of states and governments have come together on the 19th of September 2016 to discuss with the UN General Assembly a plan for a global compact on migration. So this is the global approach, trying to overcome all the national problems, the problems between nation states. At this very moment today, there's the UN World Data Forum going on in Dubai from the 22nd to this last day today. And there again today, this morning, they were discussing the problems around data protection, privacy, good practice, ethical standards, good practice in reporting, working with data journalists, and all the issues around how we should discuss in a public fora issues around migration policy. And so it's all big news at the global level. The 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which was adopted in September 2015, includes it's a new global development framework for the period 2015 to 2030. And there are 17 sustainable development goals with 169 targets. And one of the main central aims is poverty eradication and that no one should be left behind, leave no one behind. The contribution of migration to development has been officially acknowledged in all of those discussions, and the need for migration data disaggregated by migratory status, by gender, age, and many other variables has also been written into many of these official documents. So there is an official position that data should be improved in order to achieve these sustainable development goals. So where does migration fit in the 2030 agenda? Target 10.7 recognises the role of human mobility in reducing inequality within and across countries and advancing inclusive and sustainable socio-economic development and human development. But there are also several references to remittances, migrant remittances, to trafficking, migrant workers, child labour, student mobility, the mobility of health workers, and many other issues across all of the Sustainable Development Goals. Many targets directly relate to migration. The actual wording of Target 10.7 is to facilitate orderly, safe, regular and responsible migration and mobility of people, including through the implementation of planned and well-managed migration policies. This in itself is controversial. This would seem to be a very straightforward aim on the surface, but has become a very controversial issue. So the discussions around data relate also to the management of migration and migration policies. And many targets indirectly relate to migration, so it's a cross-cutting theme. For example, remittance flows to low and middle income countries in 2017 were $466 billion US. It's a massive, it's larger than some of the GDPs of many countries. So migration is seen to be something that can help to meet poverty reduction targets, such as the other targets across the SDGs. And according to the UN Statistical Division, that is working very carefully and in great detail on all of these particular issues, 11 of the 17 goals contain targets and indicators relevant to migration or mobility. And I've listed them there. These slides will be available afterwards, so you don't need to write it all down. There are 11 of those 17 goals there. Arguably, as I said, all of them should really relate to migration, as I think migration should be mainstreamed across all policy areas. But in particular, Target 17.18, which addresses means of implementation of policies, looks at data, monitoring and accountability and calls for the disaggregation of data on migratory status with age, gender, sex, disability, and every different possible criteria that could help produce more relevant policies. The one thing I noticed in the UNSD outlined targets that they identified that seemed to be missing, I'm sure it's been addressed somewhere else, is SDG 13, climate change, which seems to be an obvious SDG goal, a goal that is going to be have impacts for migration and that we need data collection on. So I put two key sources there where there are numerous documents and references and bibliographies around climate change and migration and how the two need to be tackled together, both in policy terms but in data collection terms. So the migration relevant indicators, some have established methodologies and data availability. For example, 10C1, remittance costs as a proportion of the amount remitted. Others have less established methodologies, 10.7.2, the number of countries that have implemented well-managed migration policies. And many migration relevant indicators are in what is being categorised as Tier 3. So the UN Statistical Division has organised all of these indicators into 3 tiers, perhaps 4 tiers, but these are, most of the migration ones are not Tier 3 or Tier 4, but two of them are Tier 2, which means it's achievable to actually try and collect these data. For most of the migration indicators, it's very difficult. There's very little chance that data can be collected at a global level. So the picture is quite dismal, really, if you're a data specialist and you want to collect just official data. What does it mean for migration data? We've got 244 indicators, and at least 24 require disaggregation by migration status. We've got 5 indicators specifically on migrants. And so we need to disaggregate data by migratory status across the other indicators and topics. This has been addressed, all of these aims to improve data. I'm rushing quite quickly through all of this policy side because I think this can be picked up, but I need to cover these topics and to make sure we don't spend all the time talking about New York declarations and things. But the New York Declaration for Refugees and Migrants calls on states to ensure that migration data are disaggregated by sex and age and include information on regular and irregular flows, on the economic impacts of migration and refugee movements, on human trafficking, the needs of migrants, of refugees, migrants and host communities and other issues. So that's virtually everything, the New York Declaration. The Global Compact on Migration Objective 1 calls for the collection and utilisation of accurate and disaggregated data as a basis for evidence-based policies. So there's a commitment there to a global evidence base. It's become the first objective of the Global Compact on Migration is about data. This is virtually unheard of. This is unheard of in the past. It was always data, collecting data on migration was the poor relation in any policy discussions. So this has come to the top of this global policy agenda. There's a summary of recommendations there. I won't read through them all, but it's actually very detailed, talking about the methodologies, the type of household labour force and other post-census surveys that should be implemented, the use of administrative records, and the development of migration profiles, something that the IOM has been very active in over the last 10-15 years. And there's a call for international guidance on migration data. So with all of this activity, the International Labour Organization and all the UN organisations getting involved and geared up to work on migration data, it's been quite timely that the IOM set up the Global Migration Data Analysis Centre in Berlin on the 7th of September 2015. And this was part of the IOM's response to all these global calls for action. It's based in Berlin at the invitation of the government of Germany. And it's a key reference now for global data on migration. So policymakers are going to this centre. So I would advise any journalists or students or anybody doing research in this area, if you want to see where governments are collecting data and referring to, then use the GIMDAC site, because it has a wealth of information and it's all publicly available. You'll be able to get access to the same information that the policymakers, much of it that they're using. So the various key points in the work there. The main area of work of the centre is knowledge management. So that we've got there the migration data portal. On here, you can see there are sections on data, on themes, different themes. You can click on a country, on the blue dot on a country, and you can see a country profile that gives you all the key data. This is fed in through from all the main data suppliers, global data suppliers and national data suppliers. So you've got data there from the UN Population Division, from the World Bank data portal, the UNHCR, the OECD, the IPUMS, Harmonised Census Data, the World Migration Report of the IOM. So this is an easy to access, user-friendly source that actually is being widely used at the moment and is updated on a regular basis. On there we've also put discussions with background papers, explanations of terms and definitions of metadata on all the different types of sources on migration flows, on vulnerability, on forced migration. So really it's a one-stop shop that has never existed before, where people used to have to go to every single statistical office or every different project that was operating on migration data. So this is quite the idea is a useful source for you. I won't spend too long on that, but again, Dennis is very familiar, and afterwards we can talk about this in the discussions afterwards if you're interested. The migration data portal and then capacity building. We worked quite hard on preparing data guidelines for regional data guidelines for countries of West Africa, so the ECOWAS countries and Mauritania, who have for the first time developed a regional plan for collecting socio-economic data for development around migration and mobility, and we prepared the guidelines for this. So we produced guidelines and training workshops, and all of that information is available from the centre in Berlin. The idea behind that was to develop guidelines for states, countries to work together, and for NGOs and for researchers to be involved in a data sharing exercise, it's not about sharing personal information and data, it's about sharing expertise in using data for policy in a productive way that would contribute to social and economic development in a global region. This is quite advanced work now that has been developed there. And this idea was based on the experience that I had in the European Union, where it actually took us 17 years to get a global region with a system of data collection on migration and asylum that used common definitions, common concepts, and data collection methods as far as possible, although you can't harmonise them at national level, that would be in some way compatible to produce what is now probably the best available global regional database on migration and asylum. And I have to say at this point, I'm very sad to say that having the best global data system has not produced the best policies. So there's no link between having better data and better policies, and that would be one of my main lessons from this, I think, about why we need to think about the ethics, about what is in the policies, and about what do we mean by evidence-based, what do we mean by policy based on data, and which kind of data are we looking for, and which kind of data should policymakers be looking for. So that the ECOWAS experience is building on the EU experience, but in a way that we try to make sure that you're developing an understanding of migration data that is not a simplistic one based on the number of people crossing a border or head counts at the borders, which is not migration data, it's just border data. So, and the third area of work is around data collection and analysis related to SDG monitoring and to help track progress towards achieving the SDG target 10.7. But also there's the work of the Missing Migrants Project, which I'll talk about later on, which is a very important area of the work of IOM-GIMDAC. So the main goals were to serve as a unique access point, to provide an overview of migration data and up-to-date analysis of migration dynamics and trends. This is something else that has been missing. There's been a lot of focus on improving data collection or the quality of data, but there needs to be more emphasis and understanding of how to analyse data, which questions should be asked of the data, and how to report on data. So the Centre is also providing tools to help Member States to collect data and to create a platform for discussion around migration data issues. So the Migration Data Portal, addressing the SDGs and the Global Compact on Migration, again, that's covering some of the points that I've already made. And there's a snapshot of the portal again. The thematic pages cover immigration and emigration statistics, different types of migration. There is a section on children and migration, migration and development, and migration policies. And then the portal also has a whole collection of different publications and briefing papers on different topics, which are very up-to-date and useful and have been produced by data experts from around the world who are writing on their own area of expertise. There at the bottom you can see the fatal journeys. This, see if I can use this here. This Fatal Journeys Volume 3. That was the global report that we produced last year, and we're currently working on Fatal Journeys 4. I wish we weren't, and it's the Fatal Journeys 4 will focus on children. So this next report will be a report on dead and missing children who are lost in migration. We hope that will be coming out in January. So a lot of the work of this centre is around awareness raising as well as capacity building, but policy-oriented research and public awareness raising of the consequences of where policies go wrong or the deliberate outcomes of policies sometimes. Another slide I've put there with a useful one for capacity building is a Paris 21 discussion paper which came out in March this year, which looks at current practices and ideas for the future, moving towards statistical capacity 4.0. So any of the people really into the science of the data around this, I would recommend that discussion paper as well. So to look at, for example, how much further is there to go to have global access to data that are going to be useful in policy development. We've just got an example here to look at the status of migration data in Africa. So in Africa, around 1 in 5 countries do not have recent census data. So there's not even a basic census of the population, the total population. More than a third of the countries don't have data on country of birth or citizenship of international migrants. And only 4 in 10 countries can provide data on the age of international migrants. So a lot of the work around what is needed to think around mobility and development in Africa is an art rather than a science, I would argue, in many senses in relation to migration. Some of the challenges there which have been identified by experts in the African universities and in the statistical offices are that the national capacities for collecting, producing and disseminating migration data that differ widely across countries and actors and are generally under-resourced. Much migration data collected remain unavailable, underexploited or unexploited, and in particular that from administrative sources. So there may be data collected. This is not only in African countries, it's also the same in many other countries in the world. So there may be data, but it's not used, it's not exploited, and it's not available. And the national practices and terminology are often different from the UN recommendations. Now this is the case in Europe as well. The 28 countries that adopted the regulation on statistics, which we introduced in 2009, none of them, actually only the UK and one other, officially used the UN recommendations on the definition of an international migrant. And the UK's source of data was the International Passenger Survey. So that was only a sample survey carried out at port. So even where you've got a country that actually uses the UN recommendation, it's still only an approximate idea of how many international migrants there are. So this hampers comparability of data globally, but especially for a whole continent where there are the very big problems around collecting data. There's minimal data sharing, weak coordination and communication. It's improving in the ECOWAS region, but it's traditionally there is a lot of privacy concerns, but also confidentiality, and also there are issues around people not wishing to share data with other countries for all sorts of political reasons. That's the same in all global regions. And migration data are not collated or disseminated at the regional level, although this is going to happen eventually in ECOWAS. And there are often significant needs for technical support. So there are massive challenges related around resources, really. And from the Eurocentric view of Africa, there are big conceptual problems for European statisticians to understand what mobility and migration means in Africa. So this way in which statisticians try to force the realities into definitions and concepts that don't really work even in Europe is not appropriate for understanding the dynamics of mobility in Africa. So the politicians, with these two slides, show what some of the problems of the difficulty in measuring stocks and flows, undocumented status, because in many situations it's trying to measure a form of human behaviour that has never been measured before, and there's perhaps no local need for measuring it. So there are big issues there around the way in which European Union policies are being developed towards control of migration, in which these concepts and definitions and the ways of measuring, are they appropriate to the dynamics, and are they going to help illuminate the dynamics and movements of people within Africa and from Africa. So I've put couple of slides there for which data are available. Very often it's Eurostat that is providing data on arrivals in Europe, and Eurostat collects data from all the national statistical offices and ministries. It's not from the so-called sending countries, so data, there's no way to match the data of sending and receiving countries. Slide there on which data are available. Very often the data supposedly around migration are actually around trafficking or around police measures or around border controls, rather than what would be seen in the UN recommendations as being migration data. So there's a big challenge there about which data are being used in policy development and how data are informing the policy choices that are being taken. So just to say a few words there about the capacity building approach we use for ECOWAS. We developed the guidelines based on the policy documents of ECOWAS countries and the ECOWAS region. What were the policy priorities around education, around transport, around child protection, and which would be the common shared concepts and terms. And then we looked at what are the data sources, where would you find information about children who need to be going to school from one country to another, children who are travelling with their parents, how would you identify these data sources, and how could you factor migration into economic, social and development planning and work towards a regional system of data collection. And we looked at these different population groups which were of concern to ECOWAS. So it's minors, children, so asylum seekers, labour migrants is a big issue around the rights and protection of the labour market and the development and sustainable development of the labour market in ECOWAS. So having data on labour migrants is very important for national statistical offices, but also for sharing with the free movement and mobility protocols that apply as a form of free movement across ECOWAS as is in the European Union, and as the UK is about to walk away from. And so then the other groups are students, women, refugees, a policy area of concern is the diaspora, for people from the diaspora from ECOWAS, travellers and tourists, ECOWAS citizens, the free movement of ECOWAS citizens, and internally displaced people. So the centre in Berlin did the work on capacity building in ECOWAS and Mauritania, but also in Namibia, in Egypt, in Ethiopia, Zambia, and many more places. And an interesting report has just come out on the Africa Data Revolution report, which I think I put a link there as well, which talking about the status and emerging impact of open data on Africa. So I'd recommend that as a source for anyone interested in this field. I'd just like to say a few words then what I see to be the critical gap in data research and policy. And I think it stems from several different sources. One is that international data recommendations address global concerns which transcend in many ways national issues. But much academic and policy related research addresses current national policy priorities. And that we face a methodological nationalism in research, both in quantitative and qualitative research. And the data that are used are produced at national level. They're products of national systems. Very often the data categories are essentialised, racialised categories. The definitions and concepts are unclear. From imperial past, they reflect the policy priorities of the previous decade or five decades or previous century. So the categories that we use that we collect data in are actually not fit for the purpose of the sustainable development agenda for the future. So I think that's a very critical gap in the way in which the data we have available are not serving the purpose of the ambitions of the global policy community. And the national policy priorities are driven by immediate political aims. It was very difficult when I worked in the European Commission to convince policymakers and policy officials of the need to collect disaggregated data, because everybody just wanted the top 10 nationalities or the top 10 countries of birth at that particular moment. And so why do we need to collect all of the demographic data? Why do we need to approach this like social scientists? We're policy people. So there was always that tension between the immediate policy needs and the research needs. And I think the other gaps are in our comprehension of what are we looking at. What is hidden within and behind the data? Where are the data on inequalities in health as they affect migrants, including mental health? What about access to health services? Migrant women who are living under the radar of undocumented very often have maternal health problems, very often will present at hospitals at the last minute if they're pregnant and have no care or not seen a doctor before then. So there are big issues around child health, babies and maternal health. What's hidden around housing and homelessness? How many people of insecure migrant status are homeless? And how many people are made vulnerable by the lack of access to justice, to legal systems? And then where are the gender data, the data on ageing? A very important sector that is ignored is older migrants, people who are either ageing whilst they migrate or who have migrated and then aged following their migration, or people who are older migrants who want to return home. So very often we have very specific little areas of project-based research around retirees from North Europe going to Spain, or people who are older and becoming older and disabled during their migration. But as a subject, ageing and migration is still quite it's not in a developed state. There are some experts doing a lot of work on it. Then also disability, LGBTIQ plus issues, and then racism and discrimination. The problem really is that the data collection systems now are based on looking at people and categories of people who are the recipients of policies, rather than looking down, rather than looking up at the systems that produce the categories of people to monitor the discrimination, the institutionalised racism and the production of vulnerability for migrants. So therefore we don't have sufficient data on people held in detention, people held on the functioning of the migration management systems, of the cost of those systems, both the financial cost and the human cost. And one example here I think I have to flag up is the dead and missing migrants. And I think if I could ask Dan to help me again on this, to go back to that slide that I wanted to show before. So,
is it on the slides?
Yeah, thanks. Is that one? Yeah, thanks. So this is the missing migrants database, which is also run by it's managed by the centre in Berlin. And that shows you up to the 22nd, so 2 days ago. It's updated every day, so I just took this screenshot 2 days ago. This records or reports on the number of people who are known to have died, where a record has been made. By no means does it record everyone who has died during migration. And you'll see that this year in the Mediterranean, 1,857 people are known to have died attempting to cross the Mediterranean. The project does present fatalities by month. You can see the changing patterns there, the recorded migrant deaths by region, by origin, and then you can see the details of the top causes of death recorded in 2018. The majority either drowned or presumed drowning in the Mediterranean. But there are all sorts of other causes of death that are identified. Many people die on land, and that's not ever recorded. The bodies are never found. Human remains are never found. So this is a very difficult area of work, and I think represents the failure of policy, the failure of having better data to influence policy, the failure of policymakers to react. Really, you'd think that if there was one death, there would be a response. We now see this is just becoming normalised in Europe. It's becoming not an issue. So I think that when we're talking about data and what's missing in the data, sometimes what's missing is really the values, the kind of human society we want to live in, the way in which people are defined as migrants rather than as human beings, and how is it the challenge for researchers to look at migration in a way that is also very human and ethical, and to report on that is also sensitive to the human impacts and effects of what's been happening. And it's a very distressing area of work to work on, but it has to be done. So try and find if we can get back to that. Yeah, nearly there. By the end of this presentation, I'll know how to do it. As I was saying on the issues, the ethical issues around collecting data, about recording data, about the families and communities of where people have left, migrants have left communities, the responsibility towards those communities and the rights that those people and those families have to have information. Where is the ethical issues, where are they being addressed? The immense data problems, the incomplete coverage, most bodies are never recovered or identified, and families and communities are left in limbo, in ambiguous loss. And this causes not only pain to those individual people and those communities, but it causes long-term physical and psychological damage for generations, for the survivors and for those left behind, and people left in limbo in ambiguous loss because it's never known if someone's still alive or not. So I think some of the challenges and the gaps in the data work involve this thinking that calculating a death rate is going to convince policymakers. It hasn't worked so far. It doesn't matter how these death rates of how many people leave and how many people die are calculated. It doesn't matter how shocking that is. It seems not to touch what's happening it has seemed slightly moved position on search and rescue from a very bad position to a slightly better one. But the social cost, the social harm and the generational harm, we don't know. We don't have data on that. So my conclusions are that better data do not necessarily lead to better policies. I don't know what we can do about that, and if there's something that can be done, I'd be very glad to hear your suggestions. I conclude that we need transparency, we need good quality data analysis and reporting to inform public discussions and policy choices. And we need to make data more accessible and more understandable to the public. This means working with the media, with journalists, with data specialists, having discussions in more public arenas, and talking about issues around privacy, confidentiality, sensitivity of data, data exchange, the interoperability of systems in the European Union, the challenges, the use of data for surveillance, and the need to mainstream migration across all policy areas to understand the social harm impacts of poor policy. So basically, in simple terms, I suppose I'm arguing what many in the UN are arguing for, but there's a gap between the aim and effecting this, a human rights-based approach to data. That should be at the core, the centre of everything that we do. So I've put there some of the contact details, the data portal site, and then I think perhaps we could just have some question and discussion now. And thanks for bearing with me so far.